Hello, testing. All right, good morning, everybody. Happy Friday. Thank you so much for tuning in for our 10 Things You Never Knew You Could Do in Excel webinar and community session. We're really excited to have you all here. We have a really wonderful instructor, Faz Karim, who some of you know who have taken our community sessions before here as well. But before we kick into the session, I just wanted to introduce you all to Learn It and our community. My name's Carly. I'm our community events and partnerships lead here at Learn It. And I'm really excited about the community we're building and to have all of you here. We're also testing a new live streaming tool. So thanks for your patience here. We're really excited to make these sessions available to more people. So thank you so much. And we have a great lineup of events coming up through the next month. Thanks so much, Faz. So we run these sessions every Friday. They're 60-minute workshops, around 45 to 60 minutes. And this month we're partnering with Eden Housing, which is an amazing organization that helps tenants and community and families in San Francisco and throughout California, for that matter, all the way down to San Diego, find affordable housing and provides them with relief programs. So for the last month and into this month, all of the donations for these sessions go directly to their tenant relief fund and program. So we're really excited to be partnering with Eden Housing. And we have a really great lineup of events for the rest of the month around change management, around connecting and building a community remotely, using new teams, new features in Teams. So I really invite you to take advantage of this community. It's all complimentary, and if you do choose to donate, it goes to a really amazing cause. I also want to give, if we can find Alyssa here in the chat, I want to invite Alyssa to say a couple words around Eden Housing. So I'll allow time for that as well. Alyssa, can you hear us? All right, well, Alyssa will be on at the end of the session, and we're going to show a video around Eden Housing. Just if you're interested in volunteering, they have opportunities to virtually volunteer and work with their families and help locate housing for people finding housing during this time. So feel free to stick around towards the end. With that, I really want to thank you all for joining, and I'll kick it over to Faz to start the session.
All right, hello and welcome everybody. My name is Faz Karim and the wait is over. I now want to welcome everyone to 10 things you never knew you can do in Excel. Now with this being said, I do want to point out that this course is a demonstration course and we will be covering quite a few different areas of Microsoft Excel and what it can do to speed up your performance at work there or your day-to-day life. Now, we do have some nifty topics in store that I do want to cover today in this 45 to about an hour session that we have. Then afterwards, I have a nice little video that I want to just show you just about Eden Housing and this program that we have put together for everybody. Now, I do want to point out with these topics, they're somewhat fundamental. I call them beginner topics, but it's nice to know the basics as well as best practices as we move along with these topics. Now, I do want to point out that during this session, you're allowed to ask questions. Now, we will be answering those questions inside of Slack, our Slack channel that you can join, and we'll answer the questions and post the answers and responses to all the questions in there. Now, with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. I have an Excel workbook I put together to discuss some of these materials that we have. And once I open that up, we'll go ahead and talk about these best practices of Microsoft Excel there. I'm going to go ahead and minimize PowerPoint, and I do have a workbook called 10 Things Excel that I put together. This will probably be available in our Slack channel as well. Great. I'm over here looking at my spreadsheet, and I just want to point out a few basic things since we're talking about some fundamental concepts in Microsoft Excel. Now, Excel is a spreadsheet tool that Microsoft has been using for quite some time, and they keep adding more and more functionality to it. But throughout the years, there are certain pieces that stay the same. Now, with that being said, the very first area that I want you to know about today inside of Microsoft Excel is going to be called the ribbon. Since 2007, they've been calling the top part of our screens the ribbon interface, where we can access all of our main tabs, like our home tab, our insert tab, as well as our command groups. Now you're going to notice that each one of our tabs are divided into something known as command groups. Now there's a very big particular reason of why I'm mentioning this right now. Because I used to work in an IT department way back in the day, and about once or twice a day when I was at help desk, I used to get this phone call, and people would be calling me about their office products not working correctly or the settings are changing on them. And a main problem that people would discuss is that the ribbon interface just disappears from them and they can't see it anymore. It just vanishes, the top part of the screen. Now I just want to let everyone know that there is something called, I'm going to zoom into it here, and I'm going to box it up there. There's something called the ribbon display options. The ribbon display options. And if you accidentally go there, or if you go there intentionally, it will change the view of your ribbon, the top part of your screen. So if I go to auto hide the ribbon here, and I give that a click, what that's going to end up doing is it's going to hide the ribbon from my view. I can no longer see the ribbon. But if I go back to the ribbon display options, I can change it back to show tabs and commands, so that way it's stuck there and I have all the tools and I have access to them nice and easily. Now that's just the top part of our screen. Now lucky for us, this workbook that I'm using so happens to have 3 worksheets. Now the top part of our screen is nice to know that we can quickly bring it back or change the view of it. But we also have our bottom part of our screen, and you're going to notice that we have 2 little arrows on the left-hand side there. If you're using an older version of Excel, like Excel 2010, you're going to end up having 4 arrows. But those are navigation arrows to move around the workbook. But I don't know about you, I've dealt with workbooks that have like 30 sheets in them, sometimes 60 sheets in them. It gets kind of hard to move around. So I just want to point out that in Excel, there's going to be something called the Activate window. Now the Activate window is actually a table of contents, kind of. It's a vertical list of all the sheet names inside of a workbook that you have. And if you do want to use the Activate window, yes you do, what you're going to go and do is just simply go to these 2 arrows that we have, and in any workbook that you have open, and you can do a right click, they'll present you with the Activate window. I'm going to go ahead and do that now with my Activate window. I'm just going to go ahead and do a right click, and it pops up my Activate window. In this version of the software, I can even move it around. And with this Activate window that we have, you're going to notice that I can even switch between the different sheet names that I have built into my workbook instead of clicking on the bottom there if I have a larger workbook going down to grouping. I'm going to hit OK. I'm over here on the grouping sheet. And now that we've learned about the Activate window with a simple right click, what I want to do here is I want to talk about keyboard shortcuts. Now, I know most of us like using keyboard shortcuts so we can speed up our... But if you want to flip a page, maybe you want to flip back to the start page or the start sheet in this workbook that we have, there's going to be keyboard shortcuts for that. And I do love posting these keyboard shortcuts all the time in the Slack channel that you have an opportunity to join. And the keyboard shortcut that I'm going to use is Control and Page Up. I might have to hold the FN key if I'm on a laptop, which I am. So I'm going to go ahead and use Control Page Up here. I'm going to go back over to the Start sheet, which is the same sheet, just two different copies of it. So now that I'm over here on the Start sheet, what I want to start doing is using some functionalities of Excel to add more data to this pre-existing data that I'm looking at. As you can see, I'm looking at my employee list. We have employee IDs, our last names and our first names, and the departments that they work in. And I also have the hire date. Someone said, bro, that shortcut saved my life so many times. Now, what I want to do here, because I'm going to later on analyze this data, I'm going to make a summary of it with a pivot table, right? We might want to do something like that, is I want to extract as much data as I can from here. And since I have a hire date inside of this data set, I want to add in another column. I want to add in the year of hire. So that way I can just have the year of hire listed and not just the full date in case I build a pivot table and I want to analyze how many employees I'm hiring per year. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to add in a little special column. I'm going to call it year of hire there. And what I'm going to use here is a very special function called the year function. I'm going to type in equal. And once I see the word year, I'm going to click tab, because it'll spell the rest of the word for me, the rest of the function for me. And what I'm going to give the year function is actually going to be a date. A serial number as an argument simply means a date. I'm going to give it that date cell, and I'm going to go ahead and hit Control and Enter to punch in the answer while remaining on the same cell. Now, hopefully we've been using the year function. It's a pretty nifty function I like to use when building reports that I like to print out just to show the data. But with this year function, let me just do a little zoom in here. What I want to point out is you're going to notice that around this cell address box, you're going to end up seeing a little green square. Now, this green square is actually known as Autofill. And Autofill will work wonders if you need to complete formulas down a specific column of data. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use the Autofill handle, that little tiny square, and I'm going to double click it. And when I double click it, it's going to repeat the formula all the way down with the corresponding values like 1992, 2000 for the rows. So I'm just going to go ahead and use my autofill. I'm going to take my fat white crosshair and I'm going to make it into a skinny black crosshair, not a compass, but a skinny black crosshair. And once I see that, I'm going to do 2 clicks. Hopefully you heard that. I did 2 clicks. And just like that, I went ahead and I went ahead and I completed these formulas here using autofill. Now, this column does look great, but I mean, it's pretty obvious that you can tell that I added it in after the fact. I added in this data after the fact. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take advantage of a very nifty tool that I have in both Word, PowerPoint, and even Excel, and that's going to be called the Format Painter. I'm going to take advantage of my Home tab up top, and I'm going to use the Format Painter so that I can copy the format of this cell, and I can paste it down on this cell over here. If I want to go ahead and click on the Format Painter here, I can go ahead and then paintbrush and format the cell like so. Now, with this data that we have here, now that we have our data, what I want to do is I want to end up adding additional data. Now I got the year of hire, and I realized I want to actually have a full name column because I only have a last name and a first name column. But when I want to analyze my employees, when I make my summaries, I want to show the first and the last name together. Now, I know a lot of us, we have a lot of tools in our belt. You're probably thinking, Faz, use something like concatenate, use something like concat, use something like text to columns. But I do want to mention that I have the latest version of Excel. I have Office 365, Excel 2019, And in Excel 2013, they introduced a very special tool. And this tool is helping your data. And it so happens to be that we have a data tab. So a good chance that that tool they invented is inside the data tab. Let me give that a click. Now with this data tab over here, I just want to point out that they've given us some data tools. Yes, I said data, then I said data. And one of the data tools that we have is going to be Flash Fill. And with Flash Fill, you know, like the DC character of Marvel, the DC, I think it's DC Flash, it allows you to complete patterns really quickly. So I'm going to use an example of using Flash Fill, and then I just want to go a little bit deeper and further on what else Flash Fill can actually do for you in a second. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to go ahead and click on column D. I could also click on the control and the space bar. That will select the whole column D for me, as long as my cell address is in there. Control space bar. And with column D selected, what I want to do is I want to insert a new column. And anytime you have a column selected, the column that you insert is always going to show up to the left, like the Beyonce song, to the left, to the left. It's a good way to remember that. Now I'm going to go ahead and right click and insert this new column that shows up to the left, to the left. And I'm going to call it full name. Now, in order to create this full name column, I'm going to use that functionality of Flash Fill because I'm a little lazy and I don't want to sit there and type in all of these names one by one. There's my Howard Smith. Now that I'm at Joe Gonzalez here, I'm just going to go to this cell and I'm going to click on Flash Fill. I just went to my data tab and I click on Flash Fill. It will go ahead and repeat the pattern for me. Now keep in mind that Flash Fill does have a keyboard shortcut and that you don't necessarily need to actually click it like I did there. If you do want to use Flash Fill as a keyboard shortcut, you can always use Control and the letter E, and that will actually pop up Flash Fill for you. So if I hit Control Z to undo this, and instead hit Control E, it's the same thing as me going to my data tab and clicking Flash Fill. It already says it has it, so we're good. So if you are using something like concatenate, or if you're using something like concat, these other functions that Excel offers, I just want to let you know that this can do some of those functionalities that you have. And it's a much faster way of doing it. And there's a keyboard shortcut that allows you to quickly add that in there right on your go. So things are looking pretty good. I'm getting a somewhat large data set, getting larger and larger as it goes by. But here's the thing though. I actually have two worksheets that I have to send out to my manager here. I have the start worksheet that I have the end up, I added the year of hire to, I added the full name to. And I also have the grouping worksheet, which is a copy that I end up sending to the employees. Now, with this copy that I have and the original, my manager always requests that I add my signature or my initials to them. So before I send them out, they have my initials on them. Now, this becomes a little tedious for me because every time I send these informations out, I have to go one by one to each sheet and add in my initials inside of the cell B2. I also have to go to the sheet called grouping, and I also have to add in my initials here. I might have to add it into 10 sheets sometimes all at once, and I'm just going sheet by sheet, adding in FK, FK for Faz Karim, Faz Karim. Something my manager requests for documentation, but it does take a lot of work because a lot of tedious little busy tasks that I have to do. So what I end up doing is I learned about a functionality that I can use in Excel, and it's called grouping. Now, grouping reminds me of something called grouping. A grouping reminds me of something in the real world. Now, back in the day when I was a youngster, my father was a cab driver, and during summertime, he would end up letting me ride in the front seat of his cab. And he would have this big old machine with him. This was before PayPal and Venmo and all that stuff existed. And he had this big old machine with him, a yellow and a pink bird. And what he'd do is he'd put a little credit card on the paper and write down the information and just swipe it. End up getting a pink and a yellow copy, and you'd give the pink or the yellow copy to the person. That way we'd build a carbon copy, a receipt. So he'd end up putting two pieces of paper together, and they'd bleed onto it. Grouping reminds me of that, because we can actually get two sheets and overlap them with each other, just like pink and yellow papers we used to use. I'm sure some of us still use them. And then anything we write down will actually bleed onto the other sheets. So if I want to actually group these two sheets together, the start sheet and the grouping sheet, so that I can add my initials to both cells at once, I can do that by simply holding the control key and selecting the appropriate sheets. So I'm going to go ahead and on the start sheet, I'm going to hold the control sheet, and I'm going to go ahead and click on grouping. You're going to notice that when you group something, well, both of them end up being bolded. I have the start as bold, I have the grouping as bold, and you're going to notice up top in the title, it says group. Now, a lot of people will notice that everything is grayed out in your toolbar. Like, look at my data tab. Almost everything is grayed out. That's because you're in the mode of grouping, and it's ready for you to type something so that it can bleed into that information there. So now that I'm grouped together with these two sheets, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add in my initials, FK. Here, I'll make them a little bigger there too. I'm just going to add that in, go to my Home tab, and just make the font size just a little bit bigger there. And now that I've done that, I'm going to go to the bottom of my worksheet, and I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to choose to ungroup it. So now that I've ungrouped these two worksheets, you're going to notice that on my start, I have my initials, FK. And if I so happen to open up my Activate window, I'm going to right-click. I'm going to go to Grouping, and I'm going to give that a click and hit OK. And you're going to notice that my initials are also there as well. So I can do this to multiple sheets at a time. I just used two sheets for my example. But I do want to keep in mind that this is readily available for us. And it's been out for quite some time. And it can be with non-contiguous sheets. If I wanted to do the start and the flash fill, I would just hold the control key with flash fill and start selected. But I just did grouping and start myself. Good stuff. Hopefully we've been using grouping. Hopefully we've been using the activate box. You saw I popped that up. So now that we've seen this information here, and I've added in data to my start, what I end up wanting to do is, before I send this out to my manager, is I want to make sure that this is sorted. Now, when I end up sorting this, I'm going to use something known as a custom sort. Now, I do know a lot of us are very well aware that we're able to sort something by going to the Data tab and using the Sort and Filter command group. That's something very simple to do. We can use the A to Z or Z to A. But something I don't see used enough is a custom sort or a multiple priority sort, to where based off your spreadsheet, you're sorting columns based off multiple priorities. Like maybe first you want to sort it based off their departments. And then once these are fully sorted, then you want to sort it based off their full names. Now, that way it's multiple priorities. And in fact, you can have up to 64 different levels of sorting. Now, I'm going to use the sorting functionality here by going up to my Data tab. But instead of using A to Z or Z to A, I'm going to go ahead and grab that big old sort icon that I have here. Now, when I click on sort, it's going to end up popping up the sort dialog box. And at the current moment, there's not even a single sort added into this spreadsheet. Now, you're going to notice that it's saying column A, column B, column C in this sort. So I'm going to hit cancel here, zoom out. And before I do this sort, I'm going to highlight this data set here. I'm going to highlight this data set so that once I do a sort, you're going to go ahead and notice that the column names actually pop up instead of column 1, column 2. Excel actually needs to know what you're referring to before it actually goes and does that effect to that data piece that you'd like to use. Now, I want to sort this data based off 2 particular columns, based off my department column and my full name columns. We'll do full names. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to sort my department column first. I'm going to sort it based off the cell's values. But if I use the conditional format, I could have done it based off the color or the font color. And I'm going to use an A to Z sort. Now, this is just one level. Now that I have my very first level, I'm going to add in another level here. And after I've sorted the departments, I'm going to end up sorting the first names in alphabetical order. And then maybe after that, I'm going to sort out the locations here. The locations. Have the buildings at the best of its abilities. Probably won't do too good of a job there. But the locations from A to Z there. Now I have up to 3 different levels of sorting here now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit OK. I'm going to hit OK. And you're going to notice that my entire data set has sorted itself. Starting out with my department column. Let me explain. You're going to notice that I have AC, department AC, going all the way down here, fully sorted. This is my full department AC. Now, in full department AC, these names are going to be in alphabetical order. The first person starts with a K and the last person's a U. And then from there, it's also going to show the location, and all of them so happen to be in building 2. And then it goes down to our next department, starting out with our first priority, and then again, starting out with F to T, just making our data more digestible and readable, depending on how you choose to analyze it. And that's how you choose to sort it. Hopefully we have been using custom sorting, and if we haven't, it's just one step away from what we're used to using, which is A to Z or Z to A. So things are looking pretty smooth here. Now that I have a table with all the data filled out, I've added in my full name column. But what I want to do here with this list of information, since it's fairly large, like we're going to be scrolling through this data set, is I want to have a way to lock in and freeze these columns over here. I want these rows up top to be frozen. That way, once we do choose to scroll, those are going to be stuck. And whoever scrolls past this spreadsheet will still be able to see the headers of the data they're viewing. Now, if you don't know, this topic that we're covering is actually known as freeze panes. And with freeze panes here, what this is going to allow us to do is going to freeze the top rows or a column if we choose to. And I'm going to do that by adjusting the view of my spreadsheet. So once I head over to my View tab, you're going to notice there's a way that we can adjust the view by freezing the panes. Now, when I end up clicking on the View tab here, you're going to notice that inside of our Window command group, we have an option to freeze panes. Now, with freeze panes here, I'm going to go ahead and give a click on that. I'm going to zoom into. This is where people typically get a little confused with freeze panes because there's more than one option. We end up having an option to freeze the panes, which will just do whatever you have selected. Whatever you have selected. We'll discuss the rules of that. Or you can do the top row and the first column, or the first column. Now, these 2 options aren't useful for me. I have a title. This one might be in the future, but I'm looking for the rows mainly. So what I want to do here is I want to make sure that my headers are actually frozen, that this piece of my spreadsheet gets frozen. Rows 1, 2, and 3. So with row 4 selected, I'm going to choose the option on freeze panes because freeze panes will end up freezing anything above the selected row. So I'm going to go ahead and choose freeze panes with row 4 selected row 4. And I want to remind everybody that if you would like to select a row on a spreadsheet and you just have your cell box inside of it, keep in mind you can always use Shift spacebar to select that row. Shift spacebar to select that row. Now that I have row 4 selected, I'm going to go ahead and choose Freeze Panes and freeze those top rows. And you're going to notice as I scroll down, row 1, 2, and 3 are now frozen. Now this is useful, but I already know that some people are wondering some questions now. Let me go and unfreeze this pane. I'm going to go unfreeze. Because I teach this class a lot, and a lot of people ask me in person saying, Faz, is there a way that I can freeze the top rows and the first column? Because I want to make sure that they see the employee ID number as well as I freeze the top rows. Now, in order to do that, that actually is possible. We can freeze the top rows and the columns at the same time. But you have to have the intersection of the two selected. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure that I have the intersect, this cell right over here, which touches both sides, selected. And when I choose Freeze Panes, this time, just with this one cell selected, you're going to notice that it's going to freeze both the column. Now I have employee ID that I can go across. And if I scroll down, you're going to notice that the headers are also frozen as well. That way I can look at my employee IDs at all times, as well as all the columns that correspond with it as well. Pretty nifty tools, pretty nifty tools. However, as much as I like Freeze Panes, I do have to say that there are some downsides to it. And the downside is if you ever plan to print out this spreadsheet, or you want to look at this spreadsheet in the print preview, so that way you can maybe one day print it out and put it on a bulletin board. You won't be able to. Because if you have Freeze Panes enabled like I do here, if you go to your View tab and switch it over to Page Layout, you're going to end up getting a message here. Let me zoom in. Letting me know that Page Layout View is not compatible with Freeze Panes. And if I actually continue, if I hit OK, the sheet will be unfrozen. So even if someone else had done this for you and you do this, it would unfreeze the panes. It won't go back to the freeze panes after you go back to the normal view. But that's okay. That's okay. We'll talk about how we can handle this. Let me just hit OK over here. Because I actually might need to print this out. I have these larger papers that can handle it. I'm just going to end up adding in a header here. And in the bottom here, I'm just going to also add in a footer, just because we can do that in the print preview page. Just so once I end up printing it out, it'll show up. Now when I go back to my View tab and I go back to the normal view, you're going to end up noticing that your Freeze Panes is turned off. Now even if you weren't the one that turned it on and you went to Page Layout, you've just turned off the Freeze Panes. You may or may not know how to turn it back on, but that's totally okay. Because now that we've covered freezing panes, and we know the rule about, okay, you select the above or the intersection, I want to start talking about something a little bit more advanced, and something a little bit more practical since 2007. And that's actually using a table. Now, in 2007, Excel invented a tool, and it was called a table. You know, before that, we were eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner on the floor. That's just a joke. Now, with this table here, it's going to help us analyze this list of information. And if you convert this list into a table, you will automatically have frozen panes for you. It will automatically get your headers and lock them in for you every time you scroll past them. And that's just one of many features that a data analytic tool known as a table offers you. Now, in order for us to have a beneficial table and for it to actually be useful for us, your table, or your list, I should say, should have 3 guidelines. You should be looking for these 3 guidelines so that once you actually have a table, you're happy with the results that your table delivers. Now let me discuss these guidelines, starting out the very first one. And then I'll turn it into a table. Now the very first guideline that I have has to do with your headers. And the very important piece is that they must be unique to each other. Like if I had called this hire date and this hire date, that would make Excel a little bit sad because Excel's a little confused now. It doesn't know what hire date to use in a formula or a pivot table if two columns have the same name. Now, this is guideline number 1, which is pretty similar to guideline number 2. Now, guideline number 2 has to do with the actual data itself compared to the headers. You're actually not allowed to have a header that's a piece of your data. I'll say that a little differently. You're not allowed to have a header called AC because that's a piece of your data. You're not allowed to have a header called 108 because that's a piece of your data. Now think about it. What if you go and you're using this list and you want to count how many employees are in department AC? And one of your headers are called AC. Excel doesn't know if that's an employee anymore. It might count it, it might not. It doesn't like that confusion. So, uniqueness amongst the headers themselves and uniqueness amongst the data itself. Now, one very important, the third guideline, I want to say it's the most important here, and that's just to not have blanks or have blank rows when converting it to a table. Now, I didn't say blank cells. That's okay. If you have a blank cell here or maybe a blank cell here, you're good. You don't have to worry. I mean, it's nice to clean up, but you don't have to worry about that. That's not going to break anything. But if you have a blank column or a blank, those are dangerous. The reason why is because your keyboard shortcuts that you love to use don't work the way you're expecting them to. Like for example, there's a keyboard shortcut that I love using with lists, and that's highlighting. And what I like to do is I like to use the Control key and the Shift key with the directional arrow. And that will end up highlighting my data until it sees a blank in that direction. If I hit Control Shift to the right and there's no blank, it's going to go all the way to the end of my data. But let's just say that I end up having a blank column and I do that same shortcut and I hit Control Shift to the right. Look what's going to happen once it meets that blank. Control Shift to the right. It's actually stopped. It's like, oh, that's. So to avoid those problems, we just don't like blank columns or those blank rows in case we were going down. Now that I have these 3 guidelines, the headers, the data, and the complete list, what I want to do here, I want to convert this into a table. Now, when I do that, I'll have those frozen panes and a list of additional tools that I want to discuss. I know most of us know that we can insert tables by going over to table. However, though, I'm sure you're a big fan of using keyboard shortcuts. And a keyboard shortcut that I like to use is the Control key and the letter T. And that's going to allow me to create a table there so we can eat our breakfast. Now, when I hit Control T, it's going to give me a little message box there, a little message box. And you're going to notice that the marching ants that I have are picking up my entire data set. I don't want this title in my table. I don't want my ran by in my table. All right, I'm going to hit cancel here. Well, it's a good thing I know how to highlight things using shortcuts like Control Shift to the right, because that's where I want my table to start. And I'm going to hit Control Shift down, and that's where I want my table to end. So now that I have a highlighting trick, now I'm going to hit Control T, and you're going to notice that my table has picked up the actual data that I want it to refer to, A3 to K40. Okay over here. you're going to notice that I converted this list to a table and a brand new tab pops up. This tab that we have available if you're inside the table. The cell address box. Outside the table, you will lose that tab that pops up. Like I did, I lost it. But if you go back inside the table, you'll see that tab pop up again. Now, since we're talking about Excel, I'm just going to go to the table styles that we have. And just make it green to match what we're there. It's a green table. And additionally, we have a table. I'll show you what I mean about freezing panes being automatic. Now, I'm inside of my table and I can see the headers. I can also see on my sheet where it says A, B, C. Now, if you scroll past in the headers, I'm about to scroll past it. I'm about to scroll. What's going to happen to these letters? These letters are going to exchange themselves with the header itself. So when you're using Excel knows that you have, and that's how it can swap the letters with the headers that you use. Now, hopefully we know that even with these headers, we have filtering mechanisms. We can filter our data sets based off the values, sort them based off the color values that we have. That's great, but I like talking about the modern tools that Excel like to dive out, and this, I do admit, is getting a little outdated. The ability to use the filtering mechanism, that little arrow, although it's nice, it's using tables, which you should be. I highly recommend to use something known as a slicer. Now, a slicer is a quick way that you can filter sets without having to use this area here. It's an on-screen filter, a little dashboard that you can set up. This was released in Excel 2013 for tables and Excel 2010 for pivot tables, if I'm not mistaken. I'm going to go over to my design tab over here, and I'm going to insert slicer. That's one of the tools that my table provides me. I just want to build a nice here so that I have a way to my departments and a way to filter the location, like buildings that I'm switching through. And I'm going to hit OK there. We're using these. These are slices. I'm just going to move them to the side here. I'm going to scroll up to the top a little bit. Top. Now these slicers are actual filter tools. So if I want to filter, I can filter for department AC. You're going to notice that the button's on and it filters my data set like so. And if I end up wanting to have multiple items selected, I can choose that little item icon and add in HR as well. And you're going to notice that it comes out sorted because I have a custom sort. AC and bottom there. I'm going to clear out this sort. And now that I have this here, and I've cleared out the sort, what I want to start talking about is these slicers are also customizable. And what I like to do always is I just like to make it match the look of my table. So with these slicers selected, I'm going to select the department slicer. I want you all to notice that we have an options tab readily available. Now, this is a tool that is only there if the slicer is selected. So if I deselect the slicer, I will no longer have that tab, just like my table we talked about. So I'm going to go back to my slicer tab, and I'm going to go to the options that we have. And something that I do with my slicers is just to adjust the buttons and to adjust the size of these slicers here. We can do that by adding in additional columns of buttons to this slicer. So if I add in a second column, you're going to notice that my slicer's options got much shorter there, and I can reduce the size from the bottom. I'm also going to go ahead and get this slicer over here. And I'm going to not really adjust. I'm not going to add a column, but I'm going to adjust the width of the actual buttons themselves just to make it a little bit smaller to fit the box there. There we go. Just adjusting the size of my slicers. Now I'm going to hold the control key so I have both of these slicers selected. When I head over to my options tab here, I'm going to change the color of my slicer as well to match my table there. Just with the little green look that I have with my slicer styles that I have built in. Now, with this slicer that I have and this table, what I want to do here is start analyzing the actual data that's built into the table I have. And in order to do that, I just want to talk about various tools that my table offers in terms of analytics. And one very important tool that comes to mind is going to be the total row. So now that I have a nice way to filter my data set, I'm going to go over and select my table, and I'm going to go over to the Design tab here. And as I design it, something you might want to consider doing is actually adding in the total row. Now, I know we might be coming from maybe Microsoft Word or PowerPoint. And if you use the total row there, it just formats it. It makes it look bold. It makes it put a line there. It makes it look like a total. But Excel is a spreadsheet tool. It can aggregate columns. It can run functions. And the total row will do calculations for you on the bottom of your table if you choose to. I'm going to turn that on, my total row. Now, once you've turned it on, you're going to notice at the very bottom of your table, because this is a table we're using, there's going to be a brand new row that has been added. Now, this row, it looks like it's blank here, but there's actually a lot of data points that we can add to it. I'm going to zoom into the total here. And maybe you want to count how many employees you have in this list or this table. So I'm running a function to count how many employee names I have in this table. I can also look at my pay rates over here. And with this column, I can maybe find out the average pay rate that everyone's making. That's a little outdated now. Now, with this being said, keep in mind that this total row, over here I have a sum of my years. I'm just going to turn that off. This total row can be turned on and off, but if you send this workbook with the total row on, the user that receives that email or that share link will also see the total row. I don't recommend that because that user might end up adding this to part of a pivot table. And now you have an employee ID called total. And you have an employee called 37. Now, to avoid this issue, after you're done using this total row, what I always recommend here is when we're done using it, to turn it off. And if you do need to use it again and you need to see those values or the person that you send it to needs to see those values, you can just plock it right back on and the total row turns right back on again for you with the values that you originally put in the data. Now we're coming very close to an end here. We're talking about autofill, freezing panes, and we introduced tables. But there was one tool that brought at the beginning of the day, and that was flash fill. And I did let everyone know that I was going to show you a little bit more about flash fill at the very end because there's a lot to it. There's a lot of things that can help you to realize it. So for my final little example here, I'm going to hold down the control key and I'm going to go over to a sheet called flash fill. With the sheet that I have, I just have various areas that flash fill will actually be able to help you. I just showed you one example of putting names together, but if you wanted to separate names, like I want to separate these names, I can do that by going to my Data tab and clicking on Flash Fill. Now I separated names. I can also format names and capitalize them. And this time, Control and the letter E. I can even add in special characters, like that comma, that's my special character. Control E will break it up. even with flash fill, if the numbers and the letters are inconsistent, it can still handle it. And break the right-hand side with Control E one more time. Something you got to be careful with addresses and city and zip codes because the syntax might not be the same. But since you can grab the email addresses company, giving an example of it. Or here, outdated example, because there is a data type for phone numbers now. We can format of our phone numbers the way we want to look at it. And if we end up hitting Control E, we'll go ahead and that flash fill has completed these values for us one more time. So with this being said, I do include that quite a few topics in the training. And flash fill, covered autofill, freezing panes, and using tables and those basic keyboard shortcuts that we move around with. So now that it's about 9:21, I do have a very special and I want to have a few issues that we want to our sponsor. I'm going to go ahead and put you back on the screen here for just a hot second here. Fine name. And I just have a quick little video that I want to launch out here. One. Is this? And I'm going to this quick little video.
Welcomes people from all life, all economic backgrounds.
For the people that are disenfranchised or lower income or somehow disadvantaged in our society, we must make allowance for them.
And I think if you really take that very seriously, home is the place that you go where you have real security, where you feel like you're safe, where you feel like you're surrounded by community and by people who support you. And so when we think about homes and everything, we really try to think about how do we have confidence.
My first job after college was working for the city of Hayward. Hayward was trying to encourage family housing because some elderly housing was being built and very little family housing. The mayor at that time was Eileen Weinreb, who embraced the idea and worked closely with me to try and do that program.
I've always been interested in housing, and affordable housing was obviously something that doesn't happen automatically. You've got to make it happen.
Eileen suggested we consider contracting as an option.
So even some of my League of Women Voters friends come up and to advocate for it. Not only did I have to find a group that would care about it, but it had to be one that was capable.
And Eden Housing was a respected group of volunteers but didn't have any staff. So she said, why don't we see if Eden would want to take on the responsibility of building family housing? Then I found out I had to compete for the job, and I had the good fortune of having Bill Vanderberg interview me and ask me, what do you know about housing development? And I said, not a lot, but enthusiastic, and I'm sure I could figure it out.
Bill Vandenberg in particular recognized the need at the time for affordable housing.
If we couldn't find housing, then we would build housing. There was an associate dean from the University of California and the School of Architecture. There were 2 or 3 teachers.
A place where your kids can walk to school safely. What does it mean to have people? We're living in a time where it's very easy to talk about people in ways that polarize. I believe, and I think all of us believe, that it starts with where you live, but where you're born can change your outcomes. I think that we have a role in leading a different dialogue. And we do that by telling the story of the people that we work with and the communities that we've changed.
Thank you so much to Faz for joining this the session and leading this session. I also want to thank Eden Housing for being our partner. And thank you everyone for hanging on here and being a part of our process of trying this new tool with streaming. We'll be back using Zoom next week, and I will be sharing out our calendar of events via email to everyone who enrolled. Also, thank you to everyone who joined via YouTube. We really appreciate you tuning in. Again, my name's Carly. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to me. I will put my email in the Slack in here, and we will also be sending out a link to Slack if you want to put your questions in there. I'll be collecting those, and Faz will answer those in Slack after this. So my email should be in the chat. Feel free to reach out to me, and thank you so much. Faz, anything to add before we end?
No, I think we're good. I just want to thank everyone for showing up. Hopefully everything was smooth for everybody. I see that we had some choppy audio issues, but we were working with Restream. We'll be back in Zoom next week, hopefully, and everything will run smooth. I want to thank everyone for showing up, though. Thank you all so much. That's it from me.
Thank you. Have a good one, everybody.
Take care.